Sarah Martinez adjusted her security uniform for the third time that evening, smoothing down the wrinkles that seemed to appear no matter how carefully she pressed it each morning. At 24, she had been working as a security guard at the downtown office complex for just over 8 months, and tonight felt different somehow. The autumn air carried an unusual chill as she walked her rounds through the empty corridors, her footsteps echoing off the polished marble floors. The Meridian Tower stood 32 stories high in the heart of the financial district, housing everything from law firms to tech startups. During the day, it buzzed with activity, but, after 9 in the evening, it became Sarah's domain. She knew every corner, every shadow, every sound the building made as it settled for the night. Her supervisor had called in sick, leaving her as the sole security presence for the entire complex. Sarah had grown up in a military family. Her father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before retiring as a sergeant, and her older brother Marcus was currently deployed somewhere she wasn't allowed to know about. The discipline and attention to detail had been drilled into her from an early age, though she had chosen a different path than direct military service. Still, she carried herself with the same quiet confidence that ran in her family. The first sign of trouble came at 11:47 p.m. Sarah was reviewing the security camera feeds in the main lobby when she noticed movement in the parking garage. 3 figures emerged from a black SUV, moving with purpose toward the service entrance. They wore dark clothing and kept their faces turned away from the cameras, but something about their body language set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. She immediately reached for the radio to contact the police, but found only static. A quick check revealed that the communication system had been disabled, likely from an external source. The landline phones were also dead. Someone had done their homework, and they were already inside the building's perimeter security. Sarah's training kicked in as she assessed her options. The main security office had a direct line to the police station that ran on a separate system, but it was located on the 3rd floor. Between her current position in the lobby and that office were multiple stairwells and corridors where she could potentially be trapped. Her hand moved instinctively to the pepper spray on her belt, though she knew it would be little help against multiple attackers. The elevator dinged softly, indicating movement between floors. Sarah checked the digital display and saw that someone was accessing floors they shouldn't be able to reach without proper key cards. These weren't random vandals or opportunistic thieves. This was a coordinated operation, and she was the only thing standing between them and whatever they had come for. Moving quickly but quietly, Sarah made her way to the emergency stairwell. She climbed to the 2nd floor and positioned herself where she could observe the main corridor through the security glass. 3 men emerged from the elevator, each carrying what appeared to be sophisticated equipment. The leader, a tall man with graying temples, gestured toward the law firm offices at the end of the hall. Sarah recognized the target immediately. Brennan, Holbrook & Associates was one of the most prestigious firms in the city, representing clients that included government contractors and international corporations. Their files would be worth millions to the right buyer, and their security systems were supposed to be impenetrable. Apparently, someone had found a way around that assumption. She watched as the intruders moved with military precision, posting 1 man as a lookout while the other 2 began working on the office door. Their equipment included what looked like electronic lock picks and signal jammers. These weren't amateurs, and Sarah realized she was facing professionals who had planned this operation down to the smallest detail. The smart move would have been to hide and wait for them to leave, then report the incident afterward. Sarah's supervisors would have understood that decision, and no one would have blamed a single security guard for not confronting multiple trained intruders. But, as she watched them begin to enter the law firm, she thought about the trust that had been placed in her to protect this building and everyone who worked in it. Sarah made her decision and began moving toward the 3rd floor to reach the emergency communication system. She had made it halfway up the stairwell when the door above her opened and footsteps began descending toward her position. Somehow, they had detected her movement and sent someone to investigate. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping the shadows would provide enough concealment, but the man appeared around the corner with a flashlight and immediately spotted her. He was younger than the others, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of build that suggested extensive gym time rather than real combat experience. "Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't quite place. "Looks like we missed someone during our security sweep." The man approached slowly, clearly not considering her much of a threat. He was bigger and stronger, and, in his mind, that probably settled the matter before it began. Sarah remained still, letting him think she was frozen with fear while she calculated distances and options. "You're going to come with me quietly," he continued, reaching for her arm. "No point in making this harder than it needs to be." Sarah had learned early in her security training that the moment someone puts their hands on you is the moment when talking stops and action begins. As his fingers closed around her wrist, she pivoted on her back foot and drove her knee upward into his solar plexus. The impact doubled him over, and she followed up with an elbow strike to the back of his neck that sent him sprawling on the concrete steps. The man wasn't unconscious, but he was definitely out of the fight for the moment. Sarah quickly searched his pockets and found a radio, a set of electronic tools, and a pistol that she recognized as a military-issue sidearm. This confirmed her suspicion that she was dealing with professionals, possibly former military or intelligence operatives. She took the radio and weapon, then used the man's own zip-tie restraints to secure him to the stairwell railing. The radio crackled to life with voices speaking in what sounded like coded language, but she could make out enough to understand that they were asking about their missing team member's status. Sarah knew she had maybe 10 minutes before they came looking for their friend in earnest. She continued up to the third floor, moving as quietly as possible while listening to the radio chatter. The main security office was located behind a reinforced door that required both a keycard and a numeric code to access. As she entered the office, Sarah felt a moment of overwhelming responsibility. In her hands was the power to call in the cavalry, but she also knew that once she made that call, there would be no going back. These men would become desperate, and desperate people made dangerous decisions. The emergency communication system connected her directly to Detective Ray Harrison at the police station. Harrison was a 20-year veteran who had worked with the building's security team on several occasions and knew the layout well. "Sarah? What's your situation?" Harrison's voice was immediately alert despite the late hour. "3 armed intruders, possibly former military, currently attempting to break into Brennan, Holbrook and Associates on the 2nd floor. They've disabled all normal communications and are using sophisticated equipment. I've neutralized one of them, but the other 2 are still active." There was a pause as Harrison processed this information. "Sarah, I need you to get out of that building immediately. We'll have units there in 15 minutes. I can't leave, Detective. They're after something specific in that law firm, and 15 minutes might be too long. These aren't random criminals. This is a professional operation." Sarah could hear Harrison speaking to someone else in the background, probably coordinating the response team. When he came back on the line, his voice was firm but concerned. "What's your plan, Sarah?" "I'm going to try to slow them down and gather intelligence on what they're after. If this is corporate espionage or worse, we need to know what they're taking." "Absolutely not. Your job is to observe and report, not to engage. Get to a secure location and wait for backup." The radio she had taken from the intruder suddenly burst to life with urgent voices. Sarah could make out references to the package and accelerated timeline. Whatever they were after, they had found it or were close to finding it. "Detective, they're speeding up their operation. Something's changed." Before Harrison could respond, Sarah heard footsteps in the corridor outside the security office. Heavy boots moving with purpose, and more than one set. They had discovered their missing team member and were now actively hunting for her. Sarah quickly gave Harrison her exact location within the building and a description of the intruder's equipment, then cut the transmission. She gathered what defensive supplies she could find in the security office, including a flashlight, additional zip ties, and a first aid kit that might come in handy later. The footsteps stopped directly outside the security office door. Sarah could hear voices speaking in low, urgent tones, but couldn't make out the words through the reinforced walls. She moved to the corner of the room that would give her the best tactical advantage if they breached the door. A new voice came over the radio, older and more authoritative than the others. This had to be the team leader, the man with graying temples she had observed earlier. Charlie team, report status. Charlie is secured but non-responsive. Sweeping floors 3 and 4 for the source. Negative. Package is secured, mission parameters have changed. Execute extraction protocol immediately. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. They had found what they were looking for, and now they were preparing to leave. But something about the phrase mission parameters have changed suggested that her intervention had forced them to alter their original plan, possibly in a way that made the situation more dangerous. The sound of electronic equipment being used on the door lock filled the air. These men had the same tools that had gotten them into the law firm, and the security office door, despite its reinforcement, was about to be breached. Sarah positioned herself behind the desk, using it as cover while maintaining a clear view of the door. The pistol felt heavy in her hands, and she hoped she wouldn't have to use it. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 16, and she had maintained her skills over the years, but pointing a weapon at another human being was something entirely different from target practice. The door lock disengaged with a soft click, and the handle began to turn slowly. Sarah controlled her breathing and waited, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether she lived to see tomorrow morning. The door swung open, revealing two figures silhouetted against the corridor lighting. The team leader entered first, moving with the confident precision of someone who had done this many times before. Behind him was another man, younger but equally professional in his movements. "Security office is clear," the leader said into his radio. "No sign of our interference." Charlie team must have encountered a civilian. Sarah remained perfectly still behind the desk, hoping the shadows and her dark uniform would keep her hidden long enough to assess the situation. The men moved through the office methodically, checking corners and potential hiding spots with the thoroughness of experienced operators. As the team leader approached the communications console, Sarah realized he was planning to disable it permanently, cutting off any possibility of outside contact. She couldn't let that happen, not when police backup was still 10 minutes away and these men were preparing to escape with whatever they had stolen. The moment of decision arrived as the team leader bent over the console with what appeared to be an explosive device. Sarah rose from behind the desk with the pistol trained on his back. "Step away from the console and put your hands where I can see them." Both men froze for a moment, then the younger one began to slowly reach for his weapon. Sarah shifted her aim to him. "I said hands where I can see them. I've already neutralized one of your team members, and I'm trained to use this weapon." The team leader straightened up and turned to face her, his expression calculating rather than surprised. He was evaluating her, looking for signs of hesitation or inexperience that he could exploit. "You're making a mistake, young lady. This doesn't concern you, and you're in over your head. What concerns me is people breaking into my building and threatening the security of everyone who works here. Now step away from that console." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Sarah could see the team leader weighing his options, probably calculating whether he could disarm her before she could react. Behind him, the younger man was tensing for action, waiting for a signal from his commander. The radio crackled with another transmission from outside the building. Someone was coordinating extraction vehicles and providing updates on police response times. Sarah realized that this operation was even larger than she had initially thought, with multiple teams and extensive planning. "Your backup isn't coming fast enough," the team leader said, as if reading her thoughts. "And you're outnumbered." "Maybe. But I only need to stop you long enough for the real backup to arrive." It was then that Sarah heard something that changed everything. New footsteps in the corridor, but these were different. Lighter, more controlled, moving with a stealth that even these professionals couldn't match. Someone else was in the building, someone who hadn't been part of either the original security plan or the intruder's operation. The team leader heard it too, and, for the first time, Sarah saw uncertainty in his expression. The younger man looked toward the door, momentarily distracted by the unexpected development. That moment of distraction was all Sarah needed to take a step back and improve her position, keeping both men in her line of sight while positioning herself closer to the emergency alarm that would lock down the entire building. Outside in the corridor, the footsteps had stopped. Whoever was out there was now listening, probably assessing the situation just as carefully as Sarah was. The question was whether this new arrival represented help or an additional threat. The team leader made a subtle hand gesture to his companion, some kind of tactical signal that Sarah didn't recognize but understood meant trouble. They were about to make their move, and she would have to be ready to respond with whatever force was necessary to protect herself and stop their mission. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Sarah found herself thinking about her father's advice about courage under fire. The moment when you're most afraid is exactly when you need to be most calm. Fear can save your life, but panic will get you killed. She took a deep breath, steadied her grip on the pistol, and prepared for whatever was about to happen next. The silence stretched taut as piano wire until a new voice cut through the tension from the corridor outside the security office. It was calm, measured, and carried the kind of authority that made even dangerous men pause. "Gentlemen, I believe you have something that belongs to my employer." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to process this unexpected development. The voice belonged to someone who spoke with quiet confidence, someone who wasn't surprised to find armed intruders in a secured building at midnight. Whoever was in that corridor had been tracking these men, and their arrival was no coincidence. The team leader's jaw tightened as he exchanged a quick glance with his companion. Sarah could see them silently communicating, years of training allowing them to coordinate without words. But, for the first time since this ordeal began, they looked genuinely concerned about their situation. "Commander Torres," the voice continued, "I know you can hear me. The Blackwater contract expired 6 months ago, and the information you're carrying doesn't belong to your current employers." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The name Blackwater triggered memories of news stories about private military contractors, and, suddenly, the professional competence of these intruders made perfect sense. These weren't just thieves or corporate spies. They were mercenaries, and whatever they had stolen from Brennan, Holbrook and Associates was valuable enough to risk a military-style operation in the middle of a major city. Commander Torres, the team leader with graying temples, finally spoke. "Hello, Marcus. I wondered when you'd surface again." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Marcus. Her brother Marcus was supposed to be deployed overseas with his SEAL team, not prowling through downtown office buildings in the middle of the night. But, as the pieces began clicking into place, she realized that his last few phone calls home had been deliberately vague about his location and mission status. "Sarah," Marcus's voice called through the door, somehow managing to sound both relieved and concerned, "are you all right in there?" The team leader's eyes snapped to Sarah's face, seeing the recognition there and immediately understanding the family connection. His expression shifted from professional calculation to something more personal and dangerous. "Well, this complicates things," Torres said quietly. "Your brother has been tracking us for 3 weeks, ever since we acquired certain classified documents from a defense contractor in Virginia. Documents that your law firm was supposed to authenticate before they disappeared from a supposedly secure facility." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand the larger picture. Brennan, Holbrook and Associates wasn't just any law firm. They specialized in defense contracts and international corporate law, handling sensitive documents for clients that included government agencies and military contractors. If classified documents had been stolen from a secure facility and, then, brought here for authentication, it meant someone inside the legal system was involved in the theft. "Marcus," she called out, keeping her weapon trained on the two men, "what exactly is going on here?" These men are former Special Forces operators who've been selling classified information to foreign governments. The documents they stole contain details about new military technology that could compromise national security if it reaches the wrong hands. Torres laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Your brother always did have a talent for oversimplification. Tell her about the real reason you're here, Marcus. Tell her about the photographs." The mention of photographs sent another wave of unease through Sarah. Torres was playing some kind of psychological game, trying to create doubt about Marcus's motives or methods. But, whatever those photographs contained, they were clearly significant enough to complicate an already dangerous situation. "Sarah, don't listen to him," Marcus replied. "These men are terrorists, plain and simple. They're selling American military secrets to the highest bidder. But Torres wasn't finished. The photographs show your brother's team conducting an unauthorized raid on a Syrian facility last month. A raid that resulted in civilian casualties that were covered up by his commanding officers. Those documents contain evidence that could bring down some very powerful people in the military establishment. Sarah felt the world shifting beneath her feet. Her brother had always been her hero, the embodiment of honor and service that their father had instilled in both of them. The idea that he might be involved in something that required covering up civilian casualties was almost impossible to process. The difference between us, Torres continued, is that I'm willing to admit what I am. Your brother still thinks he's fighting for justice when he's really just protecting the same corrupt system that created this mess in the first place. The sound of movement in the corridor indicated that Marcus was repositioning himself, probably trying to find a tactical advantage. Sarah realized she was caught in the middle of something much larger and more complex than a simple break-in. This was about military secrets, government cover-ups, and the kind of moral ambiguity that destroyed careers and lives. "Sarah," Marcus called again, "I need you to step away from those men." "I'm coming in." Torres made another hand signal to his companion, and Sarah saw the younger man begin to slowly reach for something on his belt. She shifted her aim to cover him more directly, but knew she was at a serious disadvantage trying to watch both men simultaneously. "Don't move," she warned, but her voice carried less conviction than before. The revelations about Marcus and the photographs had shaken her confidence in her ability to distinguish between right and wrong in this situation. It was then that Marcus appeared in the doorway, and Sarah's first thought was how much her brother had changed since his last visit home. He was leaner, harder, with the kind of alertness that came from months of operating in hostile territory. His gear was military-grade but unmarked, and he moved with the fluid precision of someone who had been doing this kind of work for years. "Let me see your hands, Torres," Marcus said, his weapon already trained on the team leader. "You too, Williams." The younger man, apparently named Williams, hesitated for a moment before slowly raising his hands. Torres followed suit, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. He was far from surrendering, merely buying time to assess this new tactical situation. "The documents are already encrypted and uploaded to a secure server," Torres said. "Killing us won't stop the information from reaching its intended recipients." "Who's talking about killing?" Marcus replied. "I'm here to bring you in for questioning. The photographs and documents will be used as evidence in a military tribunal, not sold to foreign governments." Sarah found herself in the surreal position of holding a gun on international criminals while her brother conducted what amounted to an interrogation in the middle of a civilian office building. The training her father had given her about handling weapons and assessing threats had not prepared her for this level of complexity. "Sarah, I need you to step back and let me handle this," Marcus said without taking his eyes off the two mercenaries. "This is a military operation, and civilians shouldn't be involved." But Torres laughed again. "Tell her the rest, Marcus. Tell her about the kill order." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. A kill order meant that someone in the military hierarchy had authorized the elimination of these men rather than their capture. It meant that Marcus wasn't here to arrest anyone. He was here to ensure that the photographs and whatever they revealed never saw the light of day. "Is that true?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the expression on her brother's face. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been forced to make impossible choices. "Some secrets are too dangerous to let survive, Sarah. Sometimes protecting innocent people means making decisions that civilians don't understand." "Innocent people like the Syrian families your team killed?" Torres pressed. "Or innocent people like the American soldiers who will die because military contractors sold defective equipment to save money on production costs?" Sarah realized that both men were probably telling some version of the truth, which made the situation infinitely more dangerous. Torres and his team were criminals who had stolen classified documents, but Marcus was operating under orders that apparently included eliminating witnesses rather than bringing them to trial. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that Detective Harrison's backup was finally approaching the building. Sarah had hoped that the arrival of legitimate law enforcement would simplify the situation, but now she understood that it might actually make things worse. If Marcus was operating under classified orders, the local police might be seen as an obstacle to his mission rather than reinforcement. "Marcus, the police are coming," she said. "Whatever you're planning to do, you need to consider the consequences of doing it in front of civilian witnesses." "The police can't be allowed to interfere with this operation," Marcus replied, and Sarah heard something in his tone that frightened her. Her brother had been trained to complete missions regardless of complications, and she was beginning to understand that he might view her presence as just another tactical problem to solve. Torres seemed to sense the shift in dynamics as well. "Your sister is starting to understand the real situation, Marcus. You can't eliminate all of us and expect to walk away clean." Williams, the younger mercenary, had been gradually shifting his position during the conversation. Sarah noticed that his hands were no longer visible, and she suspected he was reaching for a concealed weapon or communication device. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with multiple armed parties and conflicting objectives. "Williams, show me your hands," Sarah commanded, but her attention was divided between too many potential threats. It was Marcus who reacted first, recognizing the signs of someone preparing to make a move. His training kicked in automatically, years of combat experience allowing him to assess and respond to threats faster than conscious thought. Williams was reaching for what appeared to be a small explosive device, probably a flashbang grenade designed to create confusion and allow the mercenaries to escape. The next few seconds unfolded with the kind of violence that Sarah had only seen in movies. Marcus fired twice, precise shots that dropped Williams before he could deploy whatever weapon he was reaching for. Torres used the distraction to lunge toward Sarah, probably calculating that taking a hostage would improve his negotiating position. But Sarah's own training and reflexes proved adequate to the challenge. She sidestepped Torres's grab and brought the butt of her pistol down on his wrist hard enough to break bone. The team leader cried out in pain and stumbled backward, giving Marcus a clear shot if he chose to take it. Instead of firing immediately, Marcus moved forward and delivered a precise strike to Torres's solar plexus that dropped the mercenary leader to his knees, gasping for breath. Within seconds, Marcus had the man restrained with military-grade zip ties and was checking Williams's pulse to confirm he was dead. "Sarah, are you hurt?" Marcus asked, his professional demeanor softening as he focused on his sister's well-being. "I'm fine, but, Marcus, we need to talk about what happens next. The police are going to be here in minutes, and they're going to want answers about a dead body in a civilian office building." Marcus was already moving, gathering intelligence from the mercenaries' equipment and ensuring that any classified materials were secured. His movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting that he had dealt with similar situations before. "The documents they stole contain information about a defense contractor that has been selling substandard equipment to military units," he explained as he worked. "American soldiers have died because of defective armor and weapons, but the company has been covering it up by bribing officials and eliminating witnesses." "And the photographs Torres mentioned?" Marcus paused for a moment, and Sarah could see the weight of whatever he was carrying. "My team was ordered to eliminate a Syrian facility that was supposedly manufacturing chemical weapons. When we arrived, we discovered it was actually a refugee camp. Children, families, people who had already lost everything to the war. The pieces were finally coming together for Sarah. The Syrian raid had been based on false intelligence provided by the defense contractor to divert attention from their own criminal activities. Marcus's team had been used as unwitting tools in a cover-up that had cost innocent lives, and now they were being ordered to eliminate anyone who could expose the truth. But, instead of following orders to kill Torres and Williams, you're planning to bring them in for questioning?" "I was, until Williams tried to deploy that explosive device. Now Torres is the only witness left who can testify about the defense contractor's activities." The sound of sirens was much closer now, probably within 2 blocks of the building. Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not only her own fate, but also whether the truth about military corruption and cover-ups would ever be exposed. Torres, still restrained but conscious, looked up at Marcus with a mixture of pain and grim satisfaction. "You think you're saving the day, but you have no idea how deep this goes. The people who ordered that Syrian raid are the same ones who authorized your kill mission tonight. You're still doing their dirty work, even when you think you're fighting against them." Marcus's expression darkened as he processed this information. The possibility that his mission to eliminate the mercenaries was itself part of a larger cover-up had clearly occurred to him, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. "Sarah, I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "When those police officers get here, they're going to want to take everyone into custody and sort things out through normal legal channels. But normal legal channels are how this corruption has been allowed to continue. Some of the people involved in this conspiracy have influence over local law enforcement. So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we might have to make some unconventional choices about how to handle this situation." The implications of Marcus's words were clear. He was asking her to choose between trusting the legal system that employed Detective Harrison, a man she respected and had worked with for months, or helping her brother operate outside that system in pursuit of what he believed was a larger justice. As the sirens grew louder and the critical moment approached, Sarah found herself weighing everything she thought she knew about right and wrong, duty and family, law and justice. The decision she made in the next few minutes would change everything about who she was and what she believed in. Torres watched her internal struggle with professional interest, probably calculating whether he could use her uncertainty to his advantage. Marcus waited patiently, understanding that he couldn't force this choice on her but hoping that she would trust him despite the moral complexity of the situation. The first police car pulled into the building's parking garage, its lights casting moving shadows through the windows of the third-floor security office. Detective Harrison's voice crackled over the building's emergency communication system, asking for a status report and demanding immediate response. Sarah looked at her brother, at the restrained mercenary who claimed to be fighting corruption even while selling secrets to foreign governments, at the dead man who had tried to use an explosive device in a civilian building, and at the classified documents that contained evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of military and corporate leadership. "Marcus," she said finally, "tell me exactly what you need me to do." Marcus looked at his sister with an expression that mixed gratitude with deep concern. The decision she was asking him to explain would put her at the center of a conspiracy that reached from the Pentagon to corporate boardrooms, from Syrian refugee camps to downtown office buildings. Once she crossed that line, there would be no going back to her simple life as a security guard. "First, we need to secure Torres and the documents," Marcus said, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to operating under pressure. "The information on those drives contains evidence that could prevent future attacks on American soldiers, but only if it reaches the right people." Detective Harrison's voice echoed through the building again, more insistent this time. Sarah could hear multiple sets of footsteps in the stairwell now, along with the radio chatter of officers coordinating their sweep of the building. They had maybe 3 minutes before the police reached the third floor. Torres, despite his restraints and obvious pain from his broken wrist, managed a bitter laugh. "You're both naive if you think there are right people to trust with this information. The corruption goes all the way up the chain of command. Why do you think I went private in the first place?" "Because you're a traitor who sells classified information for money," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Whatever legitimate grievances you might have had, you forfeited any claim to moral authority when you started working for foreign intelligence services." "And what about you?" Torres shot back. "How many innocent people have died because you followed orders without questioning them? At least I'm honest about what I am." Sarah found herself thinking about her father's teachings regarding moral courage. Sergeant Martinez had always emphasized that the hardest decisions came when choosing between competing versions of what was right, when there were no clear heroes or villains, only people making choices they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. "Marcus, what specifically do these documents contain?" she asked, needing to understand exactly what they were fighting over. Her brother quickly accessed one of the encrypted drives that Torres's team had stolen from the law firm. The information that appeared on the screen made Sarah's stomach clench with a mixture of anger and horror. The documents detailed a systematic pattern of military contractors selling defective equipment to deployed units while bribing inspectors and falsifying safety reports. Armor plating that failed under combat conditions, communication systems that malfunctioned during critical operations, weapons that jammed at crucial moments during firefights. American soldiers had died not because of enemy action, but because corporations had prioritized profit margins over the lives of the people who depended on their products. Jesus, Sarah whispered, scrolling through casualty reports and financial records that painted a picture of institutional murder disguised as business as usual.
It gets worse, Marcus said grimly. The Syrian facility my team was ordered to hit wasn't chosen randomly.
Our intelligence reports were falsified by the same contractors who were being investigated for the defective equipment. They needed a distraction, something that would shift attention away from their activities and toward alleged chemical weapons threats. Torres nodded, wincing as the movement aggravated his injured wrist. The Syrian raid was supposed to be a clean operation that would justify increased military spending and expanded contractor involvement in Middle Eastern operations. Your team was never supposed to discover that it was a refugee camp. But we did discover it, Marcus continued, and when we refused to file false reports about what we found there, we became a liability.
The kill orders we've been receiving aren't about national security.
They're about protecting corporate profits and military careers. The full scope of the conspiracy was starting to become clear to Sarah. This wasn't just about stolen documents or corrupt contractors. It was about a system that was willing to sacrifice both American soldiers and foreign civilians to protect financial interests and cover up criminal negligence. Detective Harrison's voice came over the emergency communication system again, this time with a direct order.
Sarah Martinez, respond immediately.
We have reports of gunfire and need confirmation of your status. Sarah looked at the radio, then at her brother, then at the evidence displayed on the computer screen. She was being asked to choose between her duty as a security officer to cooperate with law enforcement and her duty as an American citizen to ensure that evidence of systematic corruption reached people who could act on it. If we turn this evidence over to the police, she said slowly, what happens to it? It goes into the normal legal system, Marcus replied.
Prosecutors who might be influenced by the same people who ordered the Syrian raid. Judges who might have financial connections to the defense contractors.
A system that has already proven it can't be trusted to handle this level of corruption.
Torres, despite being their prisoner, offered his own perspective.
The police will follow procedure, which means the evidence will be classified as part of an ongoing investigation and locked away where it can't hurt anyone important. Meanwhile, more soldiers die from defective equipment and more civilians become casualties of false flag operations. Sarah realized that Torres was probably right about the immediate consequences of following normal legal procedures, but she also understood that her brother's alternative approach carried enormous risks. Operating outside the law, even with good intentions, was a line that once crossed would change everything about who she was and what she represented.
Marcus, what exactly are you proposing we do?
We make copies of everything and ensure they reach journalists, military investigators, and congressional oversight committees simultaneously.
Too many sources for the information to be suppressed, too much public attention for the cover-up to continue. And Torres?
Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with the implications of his answer. Torres has information about how these networks operate, contacts within foreign intelligence services that could be valuable for counterintelligence purposes. He's also a witness to corporate corruption that goes beyond military contractors. You're talking about making a deal with someone who has committed treason. I'm talking about using whatever resources we have available to expose a conspiracy that is killing American soldiers and foreign civilians while enriching defense contractors and corrupt military officials. The sound of footsteps was much closer now, probably one floor below and climbing fast. Sarah could hear Detective Harrison's voice directing the search, along with other officers reporting clear areas as they systematically swept the building.
Torres looked at Sarah with something approaching respect.
Your brother is asking you to become a whistleblower, which is a fancy way of saying traitor to your own system. The question is whether you believe that system is worth protecting when it's being used to cover up mass murder. The question, Sarah replied firmly, is whether there's a way to expose the truth without becoming criminals ourselves. It was then that she heard something that changed her entire perspective on their situation. Detective Harrison's voice came over the radio, but he wasn't speaking to his officers. He was talking to someone else, someone he was calling Colonel, and providing updates on the police response to the situation at Meridian Tower. "Colonel, we have the building surrounded and teams moving to secure the third floor. If the targets are still in the building, we'll have them contained within 5 minutes." Sarah felt her world shift once again as she realized that Detective Harrison, the man she had trusted and worked with for months, was apparently coordinating with military personnel rather than conducting a normal police response. The conspiracy that Marcus and Torres had been describing wasn't theoretical. It was operating right here, right now, with law enforcement officials who were supposed to be protecting civilian interests. Marcus caught her expression and nodded grimly. "Now you're starting to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. This isn't about a few corrupt contractors or rogue military officers. This is about institutional capture at multiple levels of government and law enforcement." Torres seemed almost relieved that Sarah was finally grasping the full situation. "Harrison has been on the contractor's payroll for 3 years. Every time someone gets close to exposing their activities, he makes sure the investigations get derailed or the witnesses disappear." "You mean murdered?" "I mean whatever it takes to protect a business model that generates billions of dollars in revenue and influences foreign policy decisions at the highest levels of government." Sarah found herself thinking about all the times she had trusted Detective Harrison's judgment, all the occasions when he had seemed like the embodiment of professional law enforcement. The realization that he was actually working for the same people who were willing to sacrifice soldiers and civilians for profit felt like a personal betrayal that went beyond the immediate tactical situation. "So if we surrender to the police," she said, "we're actually surrendering to the same people who ordered the Syrian raid and have been covering up the defective equipment scandal." "That's correct," Marcus confirmed. "And Torres, despite his own criminal activities, becomes a witness who can testify about how these networks operate. Dead witnesses can't threaten anyone's business model." The tactical situation was becoming desperate. Sarah could hear officers on the floor below, probably checking the second-floor offices and preparing to move to the third floor. The elevator was active again, indicating that additional personnel were entering the building with equipment that might include military-grade surveillance and communication jamming devices. "What about the evidence?" she asked. "Even if we escape with Torres, how do we get the information to people who can act on it?" Marcus was already working on that problem, using portable communication equipment to establish encrypted connections to multiple recipients simultaneously. "I have contacts at the Washington Post, the New York Times, and CNN who have experience handling classified materials. I also have allies within military intelligence who are working to expose corruption from the inside." "And if we're caught or killed before the information gets out?" "Then, the uploads I'm making right now will be automatically released in 72 hours unless I enter a specific cancellation code." Dead man's switch protocol. Torres watched Marcus work with obvious professional appreciation. "Your brother has learned a few things since his Boy Scout days. Maybe there's hope for this operation after all." But Sarah was thinking about the broader implications of what they were planning. Even if they succeeded in exposing the conspiracy, there would be consequences for everyone involved. Her career in security would be over. Marcus would face court-martial and possible treason charges. Torres might end up in a federal prison or disappeared entirely by the same people who had ordered the Syrian raid. "Marcus, what happens to us after we do this? Assuming we survive the next hour, what kind of life do we have when this is all over?" Her brother's expression softened as he considered the personal cost of the choices they were making. "I don't know, Sarah. People who expose military and corporate corruption don't usually get to go back to their normal lives. We might end up in witness protection programs, or living in countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. Or we might end up dead," Torres added matter-of-factly. "Whistleblowers have a remarkably high mortality rate, especially when they threaten this level of financial and political interest." Sarah realized that Torres was probably right, but she also understood that doing nothing would mean accepting responsibility for future casualties caused by defective equipment and false flag operations. Her father had always taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right despite being afraid. "Okay," she said finally.
Tell me what we need to do to get out of here alive.
Marcus looked at his sister with a mixture of pride and concern, understanding that she was crossing a line that would change everything about her life. But he also saw the same moral determination that had driven their father to serve his country with honor, even when that service required personal sacrifice. First, we need to create a distraction that will allow us to reach the service elevator without being detected. Then, we need to get Torres to a secure location where he can be properly debriefed about the contractor networks and foreign intelligence connections.
And how exactly do we create that distraction?
Torres, despite his restraints and injury, offered an unexpected suggestion. Williams was carrying flashbang grenades and smoke devices.
Military grade, designed to create maximum confusion in enclosed spaces.
Sarah looked at the dead mercenary's equipment, realizing that the very weapons intended to help him escape could now be used to facilitate their own departure. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she was past the point of worrying about ironic justice.
Won't that put innocent people at risk? The building isn't completely empty. There are cleaning crews and maintenance personnel. Less risk than allowing this conspiracy to continue operating, Marcus replied.
And we can time the diversion to minimize civilian exposure while maximizing the confusion for Harrison's team. The sound of the elevator arriving at the third floor indicated that they were out of time for planning. Whatever they were going to do had to happen immediately, before the police cordoned off their escape routes and brought in additional personnel to secure the building. Sarah Martinez, security guard and daughter of a career soldier, found herself holding military-grade equipment while planning to evade law enforcement officers who were supposed to be on her side. The simple life she had known was ending, but perhaps something more important was beginning. Marcus, give me 30 seconds to say goodbye to the person I used to be.
Then, let's go save some lives.
Sarah took the deep breath she had asked for, feeling the weight of everything that was about to change settle into her bones. Through the security office window, she could see the city lights stretching out beyond the financial district, millions of people going about their normal lives without any idea that the foundations of military and corporate accountability were crumbling in a downtown office building. Marcus finished his uploads and began gathering essential equipment from Williams's gear bag. The dead mercenary had been carrying enough military-grade hardware to outfit a small assault team, including night vision devices, communication scramblers, and the flashbang grenades that Torres had mentioned. Sarah, I need you to help me move Torres to the service elevator, Marcus said, checking the corridor through the security office's reinforced glass door. The police teams are using the main elevator and stairwells, but the service elevator has a separate access route that might not be covered yet. Torres struggled to his feet despite his injured wrist and the zip-tie restraints that kept his arms secured behind his back. You realize that moving a prisoner through a building full of armed police officers is going to be nearly impossible, even with military training and superior equipment. That's where the distraction comes in, Marcus replied, programming the timer on one of Williams's flashbang devices.
We're going to create enough chaos on the second floor to draw their attention away from the service areas.
Sarah understood the tactical logic, but she also recognized the enormous risks involved. Flashbang grenades were designed to disorient and temporarily blind anyone in their immediate vicinity, which could easily cause injuries to police officers who were, presumably, just doing their jobs based on the information they had been given by Detective Harrison.
Marcus, those police officers aren't the enemy. They don't know that Harrison is working for the contractors.
If we hurt innocent cops, we become the criminals that Harrison is going to claim we are. Which is why we're going to time this perfectly to create maximum confusion with minimum injury, Marcus assured her. The devices will be deployed in empty corridors, designed to create noise and light that will disrupt their communication and coordination without directly endangering personnel. Torres watched their planning with the detached professionalism of someone who had conducted similar operations many times before.
The police response protocol for terrorist incidents includes lockdown procedures that will seal all exits within 10 minutes. If you're going to move, it has to be now.
The sound of Detective Harrison's voice over the building's communication system confirmed Torres's assessment. Harrison was coordinating with what sounded like federal agents, implementing security protocols that went far beyond normal police response procedures. Sarah realized that the cover-up was already in motion, designed to contain any witnesses or evidence before it could threaten the larger conspiracy.
Sarah, are you ready?
Marcus asked, positioning himself at the security office door with the tactical precision of someone who had conducted countless similar operations in hostile territory. She nodded, though ready was hardly the word she would have chosen to describe her emotional state. Terrified, determined, and morally committed might have been more accurate, but ready would have to suffice under the circumstances. Marcus opened the door carefully, using hand signals to communicate movement instructions that Sarah remembered from childhood games but had never imagined using in life-or-death situations. The corridor was empty but echoed with voices from the stairwell indicating that the police teams were approaching the third floor. They moved quickly toward the service elevator, with Sarah helping to guide Torres while Marcus maintained tactical awareness of potential threats from multiple directions. The service corridor was designed for maintenance access and freight movement, with wider spaces and fewer sightlines than the main office areas. Just as they reached the service elevator, Sarah heard Detective Harrison's voice much closer than before, probably no more than 50 feet away in the main corridor. He was talking to someone on his radio, providing updates that included specific references to containing the situation and protecting classified materials. Marcus activated the first flashbang device and rolled it down the main corridor toward the area where Harrison's voice was coming from. The explosion of light and sound that followed was devastating even from their protected position around the corner. Sarah could hear shouts of confusion and alarm as the police officers tried to understand what was happening. The service elevator arrived just as the second flashbang detonated in the opposite direction, creating the impression that they were under attack from multiple sources. Marcus pushed Torres into the elevator while Sarah hit the button for the parking garage, hoping that the confusion would last long enough for them to reach the ground level.
Where exactly are we going? Sarah asked as the elevator descended.
Safe house about 20 minutes from here, Marcus replied, checking his gear and ensuring that the encrypted drives containing the documentary evidence were secure. Federal agents loyal to the investigation rather than the cover-up.
Torres looked skeptical.
You're assuming that your federal contacts haven't been compromised by the same network that owns Harrison.
Military corruption at this level usually involves intelligence agencies as well as law enforcement.
The elevator reached the parking garage level, and Marcus carefully checked the corridor before leading them toward what appeared to be an emergency exit that connected to an adjacent building. His preparation for this operation had clearly included detailed reconnaissance of multiple escape routes. As they moved through the underground parking area, Sarah could hear sirens and radio chatter indicating that additional police units were arriving at the building. The scope of the response suggested that Harrison had requested backup from multiple agencies, probably claiming that they were dealing with armed terrorists rather than whistleblowers trying to expose military corruption. Marcus, how do we know that your federal contacts are trustworthy?
Sarah asked as they approached the emergency exit. If this conspiracy involves people at the Pentagon and major defense contractors, it probably includes FBI and CIA personnel as well.
We don't know for certain, Marcus admitted. But we do know that staying here means certain death, and turning ourselves over to Harrison means the evidence disappears and the corruption continues. Sometimes you have to choose the least bad option rather than waiting for a perfect solution.
Torres actually laughed at this assessment.
Your brother is finally learning how the world really works.
Most of the time, you're not choosing between good and evil.
You're choosing between different types of evil and hoping you can live with the consequences. The emergency exit led to a maintenance tunnel that connected several downtown buildings, a route that Sarah had never known existed despite working security in the area for months. Marcus moved through the tunnel system with the confidence of someone who had studied the blueprints extensively.
How long have you been planning this operation?
Sarah asked as they navigated through what appeared to be a utility corridor lined with water pipes and electrical conduits.
3 weeks, ever since Torres's team acquired the documents from the Virginia Defense Contractor facility. My unit was ordered to track them down and eliminate them before they could sell the information to foreign buyers. But you decided to investigate the contents of the documents before following orders to kill the messengers. That's correct.
What I found was evidence of systematic corruption that has cost more American lives than most foreign terrorist organizations.
The choice between following orders and following conscience became pretty clear.
They emerged from the tunnel system in the basement of an office building 3 blocks away from Meridian Tower. Through the small windows at street level, Sarah could see police cars and emergency vehicles surrounding their original location, along with what appeared to be federal vehicles and personnel in tactical gear. Jesus, Marcus, they're treating this like a major terrorist incident.
How many agencies are involved in this cover-up?
More than we initially realized, Marcus admitted, leading them toward a service exit that opened onto an alley behind the building. Which is why we need to move quickly and establish contact with the journalists and congressional investigators who can publicize this information before it gets classified and buried. Torres, despite his restraints and obvious discomfort from his broken wrist, seemed almost energized by their successful escape from Meridian Tower.
Your brother has better tactical skills than I gave him credit for. Most Special Forces operators are too rigid in their thinking to adapt to this kind of unconventional operation.
Sarah found herself wondering whether Torres's apparent cooperation was genuine or whether he was planning some kind of escape attempt once they reached the safe house. Mercenaries who sold classified information to foreign governments were not typically known for their loyalty to American interests, even when those interests included exposing corruption.
Marcus, what happens to Torres once we reach the safe house? Are we turning him over to federal custody, or are we making some kind of deal for his cooperation?
That depends on how much useful information he has about the contractor networks and foreign intelligence connections, Marcus replied. If he can help expose the full scope of the conspiracy, he might be more valuable as a witness than as a prisoner.
And if he tries to escape or contact his foreign handlers?
Marcus's expression hardened.
Then, the original kill orders remain in effect.
The casual way her brother discussed the possibility of executing a prisoner sent a chill through Sarah. She understood the tactical necessity and the larger moral considerations involved, but hearing Marcus talk about killing someone with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather was a reminder of how much his military service had changed him. They reached the alley behind the office building, where a nondescript sedan was parked with its engine running. A woman in civilian clothes was behind the wheel, scanning the area with the alert professionalism of someone who had extensive training in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI, the woman said as they approached the vehicle.
We need to move immediately.
Harrison has requested federal assistance in tracking down what he's calling a terrorist cell with military training and classified documents.
Sarah climbed into the back seat with Torres while Marcus took the front passenger position.
As they pulled out of the alley, she could see police helicopters circling the Meridian Tower area with searchlights, treating their escape as a manhunt for dangerous fugitives rather than an investigation into government corruption.
Agent Walsh, how do we know you're not part of the same network that includes Detective Harrison and the Pentagon officials who ordered the Syrian raid?
Sarah asked, realizing that trust was becoming the most valuable and dangerous commodity in their situation. Walsh glanced at her in the rearview mirror. You don't know, which is why your brother insisted on multiple safeguards and redundant communication channels. The evidence you've obtained will be released to media sources regardless of what happens to us personally.
And what happens to us personally?
That depends on how quickly we can get this information to people who can act on it, and how effectively the military-industrial complex can suppress the story once it becomes public.
Torres had been listening to this conversation with obvious interest.
The contractors and military officials involved in this conspiracy have resources that include private security firms, international intelligence networks, and political influence that reaches into Congress and the White House.
Exposing them won't be as simple as calling a press conference.
Sarah was beginning to understand that their escape from Meridian Tower was only the beginning of a much longer and more dangerous process. Even if they successfully delivered the evidence to journalists and investigators, the people they were exposing would have the resources and motivation to eliminate threats to their continued operation.
Agent Walsh, what kind of protection can the FBI provide for witnesses in a case involving this level of military and corporate corruption? Less than you might hope, Walsh admitted.
Witness protection programs work when you're testifying against traditional criminal organizations. When the criminals include people who have access to military intelligence resources and private security contractors, the usual safeguards become much less reliable. They were driving through downtown traffic, heading toward what Sarah hoped was genuinely a safe location rather than another trap set by the conspiracy they were trying to expose. The city lights streaming past the car windows reminded her again of how many innocent people would be affected by the success or failure of their mission. Marcus, assuming we survive the next few days and the evidence gets published, what happens to the soldiers who are currently deployed with defective equipment? How quickly can the military address the safety issues once the corruption is exposed? Military procurement and replacement cycles take months or years under the best circumstances, Marcus replied grimly. Some soldiers will die from equipment failures before the system can be reformed, even if we expose every aspect of the conspiracy. Which is why prevention is always better than accountability, Torres added. If I had been successful in selling this information to foreign intelligence services, they would have publicized it through international media sources within days rather than months. Sarah realized that Torres might actually have a point about the effectiveness of his original plan, even though his motivations had been financial rather than humanitarian. The moral ambiguity of their situation was becoming more complex with every revelation about how the system actually worked. As they approached the safe house location, Agent Walsh began explaining the security protocols that would govern their activities for the foreseeable future. Sarah listened to the details about encrypted communications, rotating locations, and operational security measures while wondering whether her life would ever return to anything resembling normalcy. The woman who had been a security guard 12 hours earlier was now a federal witness in a case involving military corruption, corporate crime, and international conspiracy. The uniform that had been torn during her confrontation with the mercenaries was just the beginning of everything that was about to change about who she was and what she represented. But, as they pulled into the driveway of what appeared to be an ordinary suburban house, Sarah found herself thinking about the soldiers who were depending on equipment that might fail them in combat, and the civilians who had become casualties of false flag operations designed to protect corporate profits. Whatever happened to her personally, she was committed to ensuring that the evidence they had obtained would reach the people who could act on it. Agent Walsh, she said as they prepared to enter the safe house, how do we make sure that this story actually gets published and doesn't disappear into some classified filing system where it can't threaten anyone's business model? Walsh smiled grimly as she checked the area around the house for potential surveillance. That's the advantage of having a Navy SEAL for a brother. Marcus has already made sure that this information will be released whether we survive or not. Dead man's switches don't care about classification levels or national security concerns. Sarah looked at her brother with a mixture of pride and concern, understanding that he had been planning for the possibility that they might not survive their confrontation with institutional corruption. The evidence would outlive them if necessary, which meant that their personal fate was less important than ensuring the information reached the public. As they entered the safe house and began the next phase of their mission to expose military and corporate corruption, Sarah realized that her torn uniform had been replaced by something much more dangerous, the responsibility to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal consequences. The safe house turned out to be a modest two-story colonial in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where no one would think to look for fugitive whistleblowers and military corruption investigators. Agent Walsh led them through a security routine that included electronic sweeps for surveillance devices and encrypted communications checks with multiple federal agencies. Sarah found herself sitting in an ordinary living room that had been converted into a command center, with military-grade communication equipment sharing space with family photographs and civilian furniture. The contrast between the mundane domestic setting and the life-or-death conspiracy they were investigating felt surreal, like something out of a thriller novel rather than her actual life. Marcus was already working with Agent Walsh to establish secure connections to journalists and congressional investigators, using protocols that would ensure the evidence could be transmitted without interception by the same networks they were trying to expose. Torres sat nearby, his broken wrist properly bandaged but his restraints still in place, offering occasional insights about international intelligence operations and contractor networks. The most important thing to understand, Torres was explaining, is that this conspiracy isn't limited to American defense contractors and military officials. The foreign buyers for this classified information include allies as well as adversaries, because everyone benefits from knowing about weaknesses in American military equipment and operational planning. Sarah was studying the documentary evidence on a secure laptop, trying to comprehend the full scope of what they had uncovered. The financial records alone showed hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts, kickbacks to procurement officials, and systematic cover-ups of safety testing failures. But the human cost was what made the numbers meaningful: casualty reports from deployed units whose equipment had failed during combat operations.
Agent Walsh, how many soldiers have died because of this defective equipment? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer.
Based on the incident reports and equipment failure analyses in these documents, we estimate at least 200 American casualties over the past 3 years that can be directly attributed to equipment failures that should have been prevented by proper safety testing. 200 families who had lost sons, daughters, husbands, wives, and parents because corporate executives had chosen profit margins over product reliability. Sarah found herself thinking about her own father and brother, wondering how many of their fellow service members had been affected by equipment that was designed to fail at the worst possible moments. Marcus finished establishing a secure connection to the Washington Post investigative team and turned his attention to the next phase of their mission. The journalists want to interview Torres directly about the international intelligence connections and the methods used to obtain classified information. They need to verify his credibility before they can publish allegations of this magnitude.
Torres looked amused by the concern for journalistic standards.
Your American media is remarkably naive about how intelligence operations actually work. They want documentation and verification for activities that are specifically designed to leave no traces.
But you do have documentation, don't you? Agent Walsh asked. Financial records, communication logs, contact information for foreign handlers?
Some of it, yes. But the most damaging information exists in the form of personal knowledge and operational experience that can't be easily verified through documents. The journalists will have to decide whether they trust my credibility as a source.
Sarah realized that Torres represented a fundamental problem for their entire operation.
His information was essential for exposing the full scope of the conspiracy, but his credibility as a source was compromised by his own criminal activities. The media outlets might be reluctant to rely on testimony from someone who had committed treason, even if that testimony exposed larger crimes by military and corporate officials.
What if Torres's information can't be independently verified? Sarah asked. Do we still have enough evidence to expose the equipment failures and false flag operations?
The equipment failures, yes, Marcus replied. The documentary evidence is comprehensive enough to prove systematic fraud and cover-ups by defense contractors.
But the false flag operations and international conspiracy aspects require Torres's testimony to establish the full pattern of criminal activity.
Agent Walsh was monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously, keeping track of the police response to their escape and the federal investigation that was apparently beginning to develop parallel to Detective Harrison's cover-up efforts.
We have a problem.
Harrison has convinced federal prosecutors that Torres and his team were planning a terrorist attack using stolen military equipment. There are warrants being issued for all of you as material witnesses in a national security investigation.
Material witnesses or suspected terrorists? Sarah asked, understanding that the distinction would determine how much legal protection they could expect. The warrants are classified, which means we can't determine the specific charges without compromising our operational security.
But the federal response teams being deployed suggest that you're being treated as armed and dangerous fugitives rather than potential witnesses.
Sarah felt the net closing around them as the conspiracy mobilized its resources to contain the threat represented by their evidence.
The same system that was supposed to protect whistleblowers and investigate corruption was being used to suppress information and eliminate witnesses. Torres watched their growing concern with what appeared to be professional sympathy. This is exactly what I expected to happen, which is why I originally planned to sell the information to foreign buyers rather than American investigators. Your own government will work harder to suppress this evidence than any foreign intelligence service would. But foreign intelligence services would use the information to compromise American military operations, Sarah pointed out. Selling it to them might expose the corruption, but it would also endanger soldiers who had nothing to do with the cover-up. And keeping it secret ensures that the corruption continues and more soldiers die from defective equipment. Sometimes there are no good choices, only different types of harm. Marcus was working on establishing additional communication channels to international media outlets, apparently recognizing that American news organizations might face pressure to suppress the story. We're going to need global coverage to prevent the information from being classified and buried.
Once it's public in Europe and Asia, American media will be forced to address it regardless of political pressure.
Agent Walsh received an encrypted message that caused her expression to shift from concern to alarm. Marcus, we need to move immediately.
Federal tactical teams have identified this location and are implementing a perimeter. We have maybe 10 minutes before they attempt entry. How did they find us so quickly?
Sarah asked, gathering the essential equipment and documents while Marcus prepared for another tactical movement. Either they're tracking us through surveillance technology we haven't detected, or someone with access to FBI operational information is providing updates to the conspiracy networks, Walsh replied, leading them toward what appeared to be a concealed exit in the basement.
Torres struggled to his feet despite his restraints.
Or Agent Walsh is working for the same people who own Detective Harrison, and this has been a trap from the beginning. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence as Sarah realized that they had no way to verify Walsh's loyalty or determine whether their safe house had been compromised by betrayal rather than surveillance technology. Trust was becoming impossible when the corruption reached into law enforcement and intelligence agencies at multiple levels.
Agent Walsh, Marcus said quietly, I need you to prove your loyalty right now, before we move to another location.
Walsh handed him her service weapon without hesitation. Marcus, if I were working for the conspiracy, I would have delivered you to federal custody 3 hours ago rather than helping you escape and establish media contacts. Unless your orders were to let us expose the equipment failures while preventing us from revealing the international intelligence connections and false flag operations, Torres suggested.
Compartmentalized damage control is a standard counterintelligence technique.
Sarah found herself in the impossible position of trying to determine who could be trusted when everyone had logical reasons for their actions and plausible explanations for their motivations. The paranoia that came with investigating institutional conspiracy was becoming as dangerous as the conspiracy itself.
Agent Walsh, what happens if we split up and each take different copies of the evidence to different media outlets? Sarah asked.
Would that reduce the risk of the information being suppressed if some of us are captured? It would also reduce the impact of the story if the evidence is presented piecemeal rather than as a comprehensive investigation, Walsh replied. Media outlets want exclusive access to major stories, not fragments that other organizations are also pursuing. Marcus was monitoring federal radio frequencies and reported that tactical teams were indeed approaching the safe house with equipment that suggested they were planning an assault rather than a negotiated surrender. We need to make a decision right now about who we trust and how we proceed.
Waiting any longer means we're trapped.
The basement exit led to a tunnel system that connected to storm drains, providing access to multiple locations within a several-block radius. As they moved through the underground passage, Sarah realized that her brother had been planning for this contingency as well, with escape routes and contingency plans that suggested extensive preparation for a worst-case scenario.
Marcus, how long have you been planning for the possibility that our own government would try to eliminate us rather than investigate the corruption?
Since the moment I realized that the Syrian raid was based on falsified intelligence provided by the same defense contractors who were being investigated for equipment failures. When you understand that military operations are being manipulated to protect corporate profits, you start planning for the possibility that traditional legal channels won't provide adequate protection. They emerged from the storm drain system in an industrial area several miles from the suburban neighborhood, where another vehicle was waiting with different federal agents who presumably represented a different faction within the intelligence community. Sarah was beginning to understand that the government itself was divided into competing networks, some supporting the cover-up and others working to expose it. Agent David Chen introduced himself as working for a Pentagon investigation unit that was independent of the compromised networks they had been dealing with. The Secretary of Defense has personally authorized this operation to expose military contractor corruption and hold accountable the officials who have been protecting it.
How do we know that this isn't another trap? Torres asked, voicing the suspicion that they were all thinking.
Because if this were a trap, you'd already be dead rather than being transported to a secure location where you can testify to congressional investigators tomorrow morning, Chen replied matter-of-factly. Sarah realized that Chen was probably right about the logic of the situation, but she also understood that they were past the point where logical analysis could provide certainty about who was trustworthy and what was really happening. They were operating on faith and instinct in a world where institutional trust had completely broken down. As they drove through the early morning darkness toward what Chen described as a federal facility with congressional oversight, Sarah found herself thinking about how her life had been transformed in the space of less than 24 hours. The security guard who had discovered intruders in an office building had become a federal witness in a case involving military corruption, international conspiracy, and institutional betrayal at the highest levels of government.
Agent Chen, assuming we survive long enough to testify tomorrow, what happens to the soldiers who are currently deployed with the defective equipment? How quickly can the military implement safety improvements once the corruption is exposed? The Secretary of Defense has already authorized emergency procurement reviews for all equipment manufactured by the contractors identified in your evidence. Critical safety issues will be addressed within days, not months. And the false flag operations? How do we prevent future incidents like the Syrian raid? Congressional oversight committees will be reviewing all recent military operations for evidence of falsified intelligence. The officials responsible for the Syrian raid will face court-martial proceedings, assuming they don't resign or disappear before charges can be filed. Torres listened to these assurances with obvious skepticism. You're assuming that exposing this level of corruption won't trigger a broader cover-up involving even more powerful interests. Defense contractors and military officials don't operate in isolation. They have political protection that reaches into Congress and the White House. Chen acknowledged the validity of Torres's concern. Which is why we're releasing the evidence simultaneously to multiple congressional committees, international media outlets, and allied intelligence services. Too many independent sources for any single network to suppress all of them. As they approached the federal facility where Sarah would spend her last few hours before testifying to Congress about military corruption and institutional betrayal, she found herself thinking about her father's teachings regarding duty and honor. Sergeant Martinez had always emphasized that the highest form of service was protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, even when that service required personal sacrifice. The torn uniform that had started this entire ordeal had been replaced by something much more significant: the responsibility to speak truth about institutional failure and demand accountability from people who had betrayed the trust placed in them. Sarah Martinez, who had started the night as a security guard protecting an office building, would end it as a witness protecting American soldiers and foreign civilians from the consequences of systematic corruption. Agent Chen, she said as they entered the federal facility, I want to make sure that my testimony tomorrow includes specific recommendations for preventing future incidents. Exposing the corruption is important, but protecting people from future harm is what really matters. Marcus looked at his sister with evident pride. Dad would be proud of the choices you've made tonight, Sarah. Both of us know that some forms of service require more courage than others. As Sarah prepared to testify before Congress about military corruption and institutional betrayal, she realized that the woman in the torn uniform had discovered something more valuable than just evidence of criminal activity. She had discovered the difference between following orders and following conscience, between protecting institutions and protecting the people those institutions were supposed to serve. The story that had begun with 3 intruders in an office building would end with congressional hearings, military reform, and accountability for officials who had betrayed their duty to American soldiers and foreign civilians. But, more importantly, it would end with the restoration of the principle that no institution, however powerful or protected, was above the law when it came to protecting innocent lives. Sarah Martinez had learned that sometimes the most important uniform you can wear is your conscience, and sometimes the most valuable service you can provide is refusing to let powerful people escape accountability for the harm they cause to others. The woman who had thought the intruders were helpless had discovered that the real helplessness belonged to the corrupt officials who thought they were untouchable. In the end, a Navy SEAL's sister had disarmed more than just criminals. She had disarmed an entire conspiracy that had been protected by institutional power and political influence. The torn uniform had become a symbol of something much larger, the idea that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, have the power to demand justice and accountability from even the most powerful institutions in society.